Hi class! Welcome back. Now this is our next lesson. Our next lesson, we are going to discuss the ethical standards and procedures in psychological assessment, Part 1. So we have two parts for this lesson, but this would be the first part. I do suggest that you watch the second part. Just a disclaimer, this video is the content of this video is from the Psychological Association of the Philippines. So I do suggest that you read on the Psychological Association of the Philippines ethical considerations or ethical standards for this one for complete details. So the PAP or the Psychological Association of the Philippines clearly stated the following. We subscribe to the following ethical standards and procedures related to the following specific functions of psychologists: psychological assessment, therapy, education and training, and research. So, as practitioners or future practitioners, I do suggest that you confine with the following ethical considerations or standards rather on psychological assessment, therapy, education and training, and research. Now let's start with the first one. Letter A, basis for assessment. Letter A, number 1. The expert opinions that we provide through our recommendations, reports, and diagnostic or evaluative statements are based on substantial information and appropriate assessment techniques. Okay, so this part clearly stated that as future practitioners or future RPM or registered psychometrician or RPSI or registered psychologist, we should have substantial information and assessment techniques before we can provide an expert opinion on giving recommendations, reports, and diagnostic or evaluation. That's for letter A, number 1. Let's go to letter A, number 2. We provide expert opinions regarding the psychological characteristics of a person only after employing adequate assessment, procedures, and examination to support our conclusions and recommendations. So in here, it states that we cannot just conclude a psychological characteristic of a person just using only one assessment. We should use a numerous assessment just to check the validity of the results and its reliability. So in here, it stated that we are going to provide expert opinions only after employing adequate assessment procedures, meaning there's a lot, and examination. So, providing psychological characteristic does not or is not limited only to the face-to-face interview or the pen and paper test. You can also conduct other psychological means or psychological assessment means to get more information about the psychological characteristic of a person. Now let's go to letter A, point 3 or number 3. In instances where we are asked to provide opinions about an individual without conducting an examination on the basis of review of existing test results and reports, we discuss the limitations of our opinions and basis of our conclusions and recommendations. So for an example, if a friend of us that wanted to know more about him or herself and has provided us a psychological assessment results, we as an expert should not only base from there. We can give them results. However, we should provide or discuss the limitations of our opinions to them. And also, we should also discuss to them the nature and the purpose of the test, so they will not be confused. and they also provide recommendations afterwards that the test itself or the results itself are not enough to conclude someone or something to the individual. So in letter A, number 3, whenever we are given test results only, we should discuss our limitations and also the nature of the test and its purpose, and the basis of our conclusions and recommendations to them. Letter B, informed consent and assessment. Now let's define first informed consent. Informed consent are usually given in a sheet of paper or in a virtual world. It is something that where you can sign on. Informed consent contains the agreement between the expert and also to its client. It contains the purpose, the nature, the goals, and also other details relating about the test and the risks of the test as well. So when a client signs the informed consent, it means that he or she agrees that the test will be conducted and the results will be given to him or her, and the risks are all clear. So before conducting a psychological assessment to someone, especially if you're already an expert who has a license, it is recommended by the Psychological Association of the Philippines that you give first an informed consent. Now let's talk about the ethical standards for informed consent. Letter B, number 1. We gather informed consent prior to the assessment of our clients, except for the following instances. Letter A, when it is mandated by the law. Letter B, when it is implied, such as in routine, educational, institutional, and organizational activity. Letter C, when the purpose of the assessment is to determine the individual's decisional capacity. Alright, so like what I've mentioned a while ago, the informed consent should be given to the client before the assessment. Well, the client can not be the individual itself, though there's another informed consent for the individual who will take the test. But in here, it is stated that we gather informed consent prior to the assessment of our client except for the following. So we can actually give an informed consent, but we should inform them when that we should not, because of the following conditions. Letter A, it is mandated by the law. For example, we are asked to give a psychological assessment to someone who is an under investigation of the government. So it is mandated by the law. So since it is mandated by the law, it is automatically we should give the client a psychological assessment. Letter B, when it's implied, such as routine, educational, institutional, and organizational activity. So when it is required by the school or by the organization that an applicant wants to join in, we accept on this one, we can not give them informed consent. However, we should inform them about the nature and the purpose of the test, and we should inform them that the results will be given to the party who is asking for it. And then letter C, when the purpose of the assessment is to determine the individual's decisional capacity. So it depends on the client. Again, the client can be a party or an individual. So usually the informed consent were given to the client. Okay, so just to make it clear, sometimes there are individuals who aren't capable to give an informed consent. That's why they have to have an assent, which will be discussed in our next lessons. But for now, again, the main purpose of letter B, number 1, is that we should give an informed consent to the clients prior to the exam or prior to the assessment, except on the following: mandated by the law, routine in educational, institutional, and organizational activity, and also purpose of the assessment to determine the individual's decisional capacity. Alright, now let's go to number 2. We educate our clients about the nature of our services, financial arrangements, potential risks, and limits of confidentiality. In instances where our clients are not competent to provide informed consent on assessment, we discuss these matters with immediate family members or legal guardian. Okay, so in this part, again, the informed consent are given before the assessment. So if in there, before the assessment, we should discuss about the nature of the assessment itself. And also, to avoid confusion, we should also discuss the nature of our services. Like, for example, our services only offers a specific psychological construct only, interpretation for that. So other interpretations of the test should be invalid because we clearly stated in the first part of our informed consent of the limitations of our services. The second, we should inform them about the financial arrangements. It is necessary for them to know that there are no hidden charges and should not, and as individuals with or as professionals, we are not accepting any other kinds of payments. Next, potential risks. Alright, so we also have to discuss to them that there are information in the test that might trigger the client or might tap on sensitive issues if the test contains such. And then also the limits of confidentiality, wherein there are some informations that could not be released to the client, and there are some informations that only can be released. We can talk more about that, or we're going to talk more about that on the next on our future discussions about confidentiality. Okay, so again, like what I've mentioned a while ago, if a client is not capable of giving an informed consent, we have to get the assent, and the assent should be given by the immediate family members or the legal guardian. The legal guardian can be provided by our department, social welfare and development, so they can or a member of it, or who is the one who signed as the guardian of the client. Okay, so they are the ones who will provide the assent. Number 3, in instances where a third-party interpreter is needed, the confidentiality of test results and the security of the test must be ensured. The limitations of the obtained test or obtained data are discussed in our results, conclusions, and recommendations. So, what if the client needs an interpreter? So, we should also discuss to the interpreter and to the client as well the confidentiality of the test, especially the results, and the security of the test as well. All right. We also have to discuss to the interpreter and the client that there are certain limitations and should not be given to both of them or either of them, or to whoever needs it. Okay, so because the interpreter should only focus on its role, which is to interpret, and also the interpreter is also being get its agreement that no information should be divulged. Okay, now let's go to letter C, assessment tools. Assessment tools, these are the tools that we usually use in conducting the assessment. So we have the interview, the standardized test, the projective test, and many more. Now let's know the ethical practices on assessment tools. Number 1, we judiciously select and administer only those tests which are pertinent to the reasons for referral and purpose of the assessment. So as you can see, we cannot just pick on random test and give it to the client because it's a standard, reliable, normed, or valid. We should choose the appropriate test to the client. For example, in Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, or the WAIS, there are different age brackets of the test. Okay, there are WISC and many more. So the test should be given to its appropriate age. Okay, so another example is you cannot use an emotional intelligence test to test one's intelligence because there's another test to measure intelligence. So if you're going to measure only emotional intelligence, you should use the emotional intelligence test. Okay, so with that, we have to research on that, select and administer only the required test by the client. Number 2, we use data collection methods and procedures that are consistent with current scientific and professional developments. So if a test is no longer valid, meaning the norm or the normal average performance of the test is no longer valid, it is not applicable to us, to the present. For example, there is a specific test that is used by the millennials, and this test is only designed to the millennials. So if now the generation is Generation Z and you are going to use that same test without conducting norming, reliability, validity, and other standardized procedures, you cannot use that same test to the Generation Z. So as you can see, we only use procedures that are consistent with the current scientific and professional developments. So the professional criteria or the scientific criteria of the millennials is different to the scientific criteria of the Generation Z. So they should use different tests. Number 3, we use tests that are standardized, valid, reliable, and has a normative data directly referable to the population of our clients. Like what I've said a while ago, we use appropriate test to the appropriate client. So when can we say that a test is standardized, valid, reliable, and has a norm? So standardization explains more on the administration, interpretation, and analyzation of the results. So there's a standard steps for that, and that could be read in the test booklet that is provided alongside with the test. So the interpreter, the professional or the expert should take note of that. Next, valid. It is the purpose of the test is consistent to its goal. Next, reliable or is consistent. So if the test is measuring emotional intelligence, it should be consistent in measuring only emotional intelligence and has a normative data, meaning it has already been used and was performed by the same group and has performed a normal average performance, meaning that this test already has an evidence of of a good performance and is valid, reliable, and standard. All right. Number 4, we administer assessment tools that are appropriate to the language, competence, and other relevant characteristics of our client. So, as I mentioned a while ago, we cannot use a test that is not appropriate to the client. For example, the whisk and the waist. So both are intelligence tests, but the whisk is used for children and the waist is used for adults. So if you asked a child to answer waist, there are different terms there that only adults can understand. So it should not be used to children. Same with the children to the adults. If the adults will take the whisk, yeah, it might be easier for them, but it would not be valid because it's not appropriate to their age. Language is one big factor to measure the construct or the one being measured in the test. So it should be checked as well, and it should be appropriate. Letter D. Obsolete and outdated test results. Obsolete meaning it's no longer scientifically proven to the present situation. Outdated means it's in simple terms it's a bit kind of expired. All right. So let's have number 1. We do not base our interpretations, conclusions, and recommendations on outdated test results. So if a child who was able to take an intelligence test when he was still in grade school, the test results when he was still in grade school is no longer valid when he entered college. There should be another individual test for that because because every now and then individuals grow and they learn and they change. So the test results, the individual's test result or the child test results when he was in elementary is no longer valid to be used as a basis in entering college. There should be another test for that. Number 2, we do not provide interpretations, conclusions, and recommendations on the basis of obsolete tests. Again, obsolete tests, these are no longer standard. It does not gone through standardization, norming, reliability, and validity. So it's no longer valid to the present. So if you're going to interpret, we are not allowed to interpret, conclude, and give recommendations on tests that are no longer valid until to the present. Letter E. Interpreting assessment results. Okay, so after we conducted the assessment to the client, we are going to interpret it. Here are the ethical standards. Number 1, in fairness to our clients, under no circumstances should we report the test results without taking into consideration the validity, reliability, and appropriateness of the test. We should therefore indicate our reservations regarding the interpretations. So the interpretation, either verbal or written, we should include there its limitations and consider its validity until when, its consistency or reliability, and the appropriateness of the test. Number 2, we interpret assessment results while considering the purpose of the assessment, and other factors such as the client's test-taking abilities, characteristics, situational, personal, and cultural differences. So when we are assessing the results, we should consider on other factors that may affect the test results, like its abilities rather, and also ability, its current situation, does he or she is experiencing personal issues, and does he or she has a cultural background that is not appropriate for the test. So that all of that should be considered before the test and also should be considered after taking the test and interpreting the test. All right, so that's the final part for the first part of the ethical considerations for the psychological providing a psychological assessment. So just to give credits, again, the content of this PowerPoint is from the Psychological Association of the Philippines Scientific and Professional Ethics Committee 2008 and 2009. So that's all for now. See you on the second part.